Hello and welcome to the JCN Clinic podcast show. I'm Jessica, and today I am really lucky to be joined by Alyssa Tait, who is a naturopath and physiotherapist who has an array of qualifications, let me just say. And we were just talking before we hit record, we could talk about all sorts of topics today, but our topic of conversation is going to be heavily around prebiotics. So welcome, Alyssa. So I wanted to start with the very common, as shall we just say, introduction, because everyone needs to know a bit about you. I have chatted about your background in our intro, but I'd love for you just to give the listeners a little bit of detail about who you are and your passion areas, let's just say, within the industry. Mm. Mm. Absolutely. I think it's really fascinating that you have that combination of the two areas with the physiotherapy and bringing that to the table with the gut health and the microbiome, like particularly the functionality as well. Like as you said, you do see clinically so much sort of overplay of issues in that pelvic region. And I imagine, you would see a lot as far as not, which we won't talk as much about today, um, the functional component of what's going on, let alone what's happening with the microbiome. I find that really fascinating. But again, maybe it'll come up a little bit today, but quite possible. So we are going to talk about prebiotics today. Um, where did I'm sure it naturally grew as you dove into the gut and the microbiome, but for you, like to be so heavily interested in prebiotics and be involved in a lot of the, research around prebiotics, where did that come from? Hmm.
Because I was on a project with Queensland in combination with a couple of government agencies, and it was about developing clinical practice guidelines for health professionals for the management of incontinence in older people. So it was a very specific thing, and over a couple of years, we basically, went through that process of developing a clinical practice guideline where you appraise the research and you evaluate it and you rank it and all these sorts of things, and you come up with specific guidelines, which I think that was in the early 2000s, and it was a very good guide when it came out. But I was I was on the team with another physiotherapist and a couple of continence nurses. And my interest was, I was always very interested in the bowels and bowel health. And I wanted to see if I could sneak in a little bit more into this practice guideline beyond more of that sort of, pelvic floor exercises, bladder, management, all that sort of usual continence stuff. And we always have a little bit of bowels. I mean, bowels, of course, are a really important part of managing continence issues, but somehow I persuaded them that it would be a good idea for me to delve a little bit into what was known about prebiotics and probiotics. And back then, this was really limited to just looking at some narrative reviews. And I think it was Roper Freud was one of those early researchers, maybe even for developing that term prebiotic. And so I managed to sort of get that into that guideline back then. And now I think back about how much better my understanding is. But really, actually, it's for everybody. I think it's changed a lot in that time. So, even in terms of what substrates are being explored as prebiotics has changed, and the whole landscape of prebiotics and probiotics, and how to evaluate the gut microbiome. And that wasn't really, it was very experimental back then. So that's when it all sort of started.
Yeah, fascinating. I love that you just managed to slip that in there, and good on you.
Once it's off the chain, there's like, okay.
Well, that's actually a good segue with what you're saying about the understanding of prebiotics. I wanted to start there with explaining what prebiotics are, because I know clinically that I see clients have they know the word. Most of them know the word, but they're very confused about what it is. There's a lot of confusion even between prebiotics and probiotics. And I'd even say practitioners are still like, there's practitioners listen to this show. I even see some practitioners that get a little confused with the terminology. So I'd love you to start there and explain to the audience, what are prebiotics?
Right. So, the official current definition of prebiotics, where we're up to, is that they're substrates that are selectively utilized by host microorganisms, conferring a health benefit. So they are, substances of some kind that the organism can use. It's a broad-ish definition now, that there can be obviously different microbiomes that use those things, whether it's skin microbiome or gut microbiome or whatever. But I think the key thing is the health benefit. This is what has evolved a little bit more over time. So originally, I think when prebiotics was developed as a concept, it was like substances that changed the microbiome. And I think that early research was really about the things that caused an increase, at least as far as the gut went, increase in bifidobacteria. But over time, I think now the more strict definition is there needs to be a documentation from the research of a health benefit. So there's much more of an emphasis on the clinical benefit. And this sometimes makes it a little bit tricky for, I mean, as clinicians and practitioners, we're interested in health outcomes. That is what we want to see, how we can help change and improve the health of our patients. And obviously that's what they're interested in as well, mostly. But mechanisms are still important and help us move forward more quickly in the field, I guess. But sometimes when you're looking at the research, you're almost choosing between studies that show a health benefit. Like there's tons of research on the effects of inulin on dysglycemia types of situations, basically. But many of those same studies didn't look at its impact on the microbiome. And then there's tons of other studies that look at an impact on the microbiome, but didn't necessarily measure a health benefit. And we need to kind of try to bring those together, especially as most of our knowledge, I think, on the function of especially the long-standing prebiotics like inulin and fructooligosaccharides, these kinds of ones was based on either in vitro data or multi-stage compartment or fermentation kind of compartment, studies where they kind of have a setup that is meant in many ways to mimic, the human digestion and the different compartments of the gut. Usually there's either 2 or 3 stages, and they're really useful for just like straight up information on, okay, so which ones are the high yielders. We know that inulin like produces big change and large amounts uh, gases, for example. That's part of its metabolic function. And then there are others that are slower to produce that or don't produce quite as high amounts. But all that is still, so much of that is in those more basic science studies. And so you then have that challenge of that research on humans, and they will have, a limited number of subjects who already have such diverse microbiomes, and so in the studies that actually look at individual effects or varying effects among individuals, where they're actually looking at the different, they will show different effects, so it's, we can fall into the trap of going, oh, it's so individual, who even knows? But the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think we can still get a reasonable amount of information about what's likely to cause this change, and then we can just kind of like work with our patients and document that. But I think, as I've done work in that kind of research space, or that synthesis of research space or evaluation of research space. But as a clinician, your role, my role, and your role, all of us, it is very much focused on the patient, their goals, the outcomes, their quality of life, all of that sort of stuff. So somewhere we have to balance this fact that we don't have that full understanding of exactly what it might do to their microbiome, but we have a pretty good sense, and we can have a better sense if we do follow the research and then apply that, and then monitor what's happening with our patients.
Yeah, I love that. I love, as you said, we respect the fact that there are these individual microbiome footprints, but the answer isn't to throw our hands up in the air and be like, oh, well, everyone's different. What's the point? As such? But also, like, on the other end of the spectrum, it's not as easy as A equals B equals C. It's like, okay, as you said, with studies, we're seeing that, like, just purely microbiome based, or let's say species based, that if we put inulin in a certain environment, this is the outcome as far as these particular gases and how it influences these particular microbes. But as you said, which brings right back to like this sort of understanding of what prebiotics are, what are the health benefits of that? So then it's like, what does that do? What's the health outcomes of that in an individual? And that's where it's hard. And we see that clinically, because there's what the expectation is versus what it can potentially be in a person to person. But I do believe, I so agree that there's still a middle ground there. There's still a likely way that this will develop. And that's where more and more research needs to be done to see more and more what those flow throughs are, that A to B to C, so we can have more information, and then, as always, as clinicians, be able to just modulate that with our clients to suit.
That's right. And I think we're actually ideally positioned to do that, because we're the ones who can apply that research knowledge in the clinic and see what happens, and then almost feedback as what kind of research needs to be done. I'm thinking of a good example in a case study I'm preparing at the moment, of somebody where her key, goal, or her key focus was constipation, and the cluster of things that went with it was bloating and incomplete emptying and too much wiping and all these kinds of things that often kind of go together. And we did, tested the gut microbiome beforehand. We'd already started some things, as an empirical kind of trials with her anyway, but it's like, oh, let's see what more information we can get from the gut microbiome. Got lots of great information. Oh, great, we could action this and that and the other. And so we did action this and that and the other. And interestingly, she didn't get the change. She wasn't getting the change. And I was, oh my goodness, it's all about getting that change. But then we retested the microbiome, and she had great changes to many of these, these metabolic functions, or these, the microbes that produce these metabolic functions, things that seemed really favorable and will probably be favorable in her long-term health.
Mm.
And that was so informative. So great, we know that doing X, Y, Z can cause ABC, but if things hadn't changed until at around about the same time as we were doing the retesting, we took a different path. And
Right.
then while we were waiting for the test, she started to improve. And
Mm.
so it's still a benefit, even though, you'd rather it's just this perfect textbook situation of not
Yes.
only did it improve her health, but the gut microbiome also, became wonderful as well. It was like, okay, well, they're related, but they're not equivalent at all. And we
Mm-hmm.
see that more than anyone
Mm-hmm.
as the clinician. Whereas in research, they might go, but look, we've got all this evidence that this can improve this metabolic outcome, or that like marker of health in the individual. Well, that may be the case, but that may not be their main issue. It may not even be giving them any symptoms. And ultimately, symptoms
Exactly.
are usually what people are seeing us for. So
Yes.
I think that's wonderful, because it's like we can then also start to understand not only what is the relationship, but what isn't. Like where do they diverge a little bit, and where do we go,
Mm.
wow, the gut microbiome stuff doesn't inform me as well with this kind of picture, or it's helpful because I want to know I'm not making it head in an unfavorable direction with
Mm-hmm.
some intervention, dietary or otherwise, but actually it's other things, other clinical tools that I use in conjunction with that, really, that will sometimes be the thing to make a change. I think bloating would be another good example. Like, you can't look at a gut microbiome and go, I have found the, holy grail answer to all your bloating issues with every person. It's just not, in my experience,
It's
it's not
so
the, if
true.
it's other people's experience, I'd love to know, but it's not in mine. So there's
Oh
so many
no.
other things to do that.
It's so complex. It's so complex.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think that's, I can think of a ton of examples in similar veins, which I'm sure will come up as we go through. But I think that's really helpful. That gives people a really good idea of what prebiotics are, and perhaps as we go through, we'll mention a few more that I think definitely clinicians will have heard of, but even just the general person listening, there might be some that come up for them to understand a little bit about, particularly as we go through even this sort of concept of where fiber fits in that versus, not sort of classically fiber prebiotics. But let's talk a bit more about the gut specifically. So why are these prebiotics so crucial for fostering a really healthy gut microbiome? Big question, huge question. But what are those sort
Yeah.
of key concepts that come up when you think about that really strong relationship between prebiotics and a healthy gut?
Yeah. I think, the gut microbiome, when we all first started learning about it more, we probably were exposed to that idea of it being like a forgotten organ. And I kind of really like that, because it's like, organs have a physiological function and have metabolic activity and produce metabolites, and that's and that influences the health of the rest of the body. They all interact with each other, and that's exactly what the gut microbiome is as well. So I think that it's, because it's been poorly studied, and most of us, when we did our undergrad training, we learned plenty about, the cardiovascular system and immunological system, and pulmonary, all sorts of different things. We have all that physiology under our belt, but there's this whole kind of black hole of missing physiology. And so we know that the metabolic activity of the microorganisms that live in the gut is substantial and has major influences on every system of the body, all the functioning of the body. You can kind of group it, and you can go, oh, cardiovascular effects, immunological effects, like there's just, it's really sort of you can just think of these, I think, as signals like everything else.
Mm.
So, we started off and we learned our neurological system, and we learned neurotransmitters are this, and we learned our endocrinological and hormones are this. And then over time, we're like, oh, they're all kind of signaling molecules, and some of them function as both. And then there's some that you've never heard of that actually don't quite fit into either category. So it's all in some ways just signaling molecules. And this is exactly what the metabolites produced via the gut microbiome are as well. So it's just another big part of the connections going on with everything else. I think our patients kind of often, I guess it depends who you see, but often they intuitively, understand that or think, yes, that makes sense. People know that their digestion and their gut function affects their well-being. But then again, I suppose this brings up another concept that's sometimes a little bit of a clash, I find, which is that sometimes people believe that if they lack gastrointestinal symptoms, that then therefore by default they don't have any gut problems or gut microbiome problems, and everything is perfect in that department, and the other way around as well. So you can get people who have a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms, and yet the metabolic function, there are many positives of the metabolic function in their gut microbiome. So they're not equivalent either. Like you said, everything's complex, So it is a very important part of the signaling system going on through the body. But we can't assume we understand it without actually getting some data, which is what the testing will do.
For sure. Yeah, I love hearing you talk about, I hadn't really thought about it in quite some time, but it's so true with thinking right back to studying the human biology. And yeah, the gut for me, likewise to yourself, like there was hardly any discussion of the microbiome. Like it was such in its infancy. But everything else had its place, but there wasn't really any discussion around those, the microbiome or the metabolites and I love how you're sort of, or that concept is there. Yeah, that concept of them being, the signaling molecules that they are in their own right. But definitely I can think back, even like a good 15, 16 years ago where clients, they still, as you said, they innately just knew when they would come to you, and it was like you were almost the quack, to use that term, to even talk about why their gut issues may be causing them fatigue, or their gut issues might be causing them immune irregularities or whatever that might be. But then they would sit there and they would nod and I'd be like, yes, this just seems right. But I can recall even some of those clients in the earlier days, as slowly some information was becoming more mainstream and getting a bit more attention, that I would hear from them and they'd be like, oh, Jess, this is what you were telling me. I saw it on the news, or
That's gratifying to see that. Yes. So I feel like I still have the experience of other primary care practitioners. The understanding of the gut microbiome is not up to where their understanding of the rest of the body system is.
Absolutely.
So, and it's not to say everyone needs to be an expert. No, of course not. That's why we all refer to each other for, the particular focus that we have. But it would be nice if there was at least just that minimum understanding of, that there are metabolic effects that occur because of the microorganisms that live in the gut. Even that would be just a nice start, because if that message was reinforced, to the patient by the GP or the specialist, even if they didn't have any further knowledge or any desire to go further into that, just have that acknowledgement would make it feel less like there was this kind of, the poor patients in the middle of, we've got all this information and knowledge, and then there's, it's not being reinforced from the other side. So they're like, who do I trust? Because they can't both.
It's a real problem still, unfortunately. Exactly right. Yeah, I would agree. And particularly, as you say, we don't all have to be specialists, but not shooting it down or not, speaking of it unfavorably, I'm going to say it due to ignorance in a lot of circumstances. Unfortunately, and I know you would see that clinically too with clients, but then I definitely am seeing a little bit more, thankfully, of a sway starting to happen. I can think of a client just recently in the last 6 months whose gastroenterologist had sent them off for a microbiome stool test, and I was just like, clapping my hands in the background. I was like, what? Your gastroenterologist did that? And she's like, yeah. You're like, wow,
my
times are
goodness.
changing.
Yeah, sure.
uh,
Absolutely.
so what I'd love to chat a little bit, and we just sort of alluded to it a minute ago in regard to the prebiotics, is how they're affecting the gut microbiome. So what are some of those more individualized effects? And they are plentiful and there are many, but if we had to choose maybe some of the key big areas for people to get a little bit of an understanding of, that would be great, just to explore a little bit more. Remembering, again, some of our listeners are practitioners, but there is a lot that aren't. So for them,
Sure.
understanding that relationship between the gut and then that systemic effect is really ideal.
Yeah. So one of the main ones that comes to mind is that prebiotics increase the growth and activity of certain bacteria that produce something called short chain fatty acids. And these are really nothing to do with fats or, this sort of stuff. It's a chemical term basically of these metabolites, or these products that arise in the gut microbiome from the metabolic activity. So as all those bacteria are busy doing their thing, what they produce is these short chain fatty acids. And there's three main ones: acetate, butyrate, and propionate, which are known to be beneficial for human health. So they're beneficial not only for the health of the gut and the intestinal barrier, the lining of the gut, all of the local kind of activity, but even more so, they are beneficial to the systemic function of the human being. So they will be absorbed through the gut lining and circulate through the rest of the body and have impact just like hormones do and just like neurotransmitters do. They're just another signal, basically. And they have a big role to play in metabolic health, so being metabolically healthy, and your brain being healthy, and having energy, and having a good balance between inflammation and dampening down inflammation, which we all need. So those are like really critical, and those are produced in part by eating, good diet and high fiber food, but can be produced in very concentrated or higher amounts, specifically by using prebiotics. And so that's one of the big ones. There are also changes in the type of gases that are produced. And again, that's from the type of microbes that are fed by these prebiotics. So, whatever you feed, you encourage to grow, and you encourage its activity. So there can be impacts on certain gases, one of them being hydrogen sulfide, which is an important substance in the gut, but like with many things, it's a case of too high or too low is a problem. So too high amounts can compromise that intestinal barrier, and so certain prebiotics can reduce the organisms, the microbes that produce that, and therefore you're likely to produce less of that. And this is always of interest to people because it's something that most people do recognize, and that is because it's often responsible for what's sometimes called that rotten egg gas, stinky wind, and you can see when you say this to your patients, they'll, identify that immediately, or if they're with a partner or a family member, there's always some jokes that go on about that.
Yeah.
But it's something that everyone can recognize. So this is what, prebiotics can influence. And this is an example of a very noteworthy symptom that they can actually change. So, those are just two examples. There's also enzymes in the gut that have a role in detoxification. One enzyme called beta-glucuronidase. Certain prebiotics have been shown to be able to reduce that enzyme. This one, everyone probably has their own way of describing it, but sometimes I describe this as if you are trying to remove substances from the body as you're clearing them, and one of them would be estrogen. If you have handcuffs on the estrogen, you can more readily, walk it out and get it out of the situation. But the beta glucuronidase is kind of like the key to the handcuffs. So it lets the estrogen run wild again in the system. I don't know, this sort of works for me. So, you sometimes want to reduce those Ts because it's like, we're quite happy removing either those metabolites of estrogen or, those chemicals that we're exposed to that use that same system. So this is one very, very concrete way that doing something specific to the gut microbiome can actually improve detoxification. So much as people, sometimes, there's sometimes a bit of eye rolling about detoxification and this comment that your liver will do that anyway. Well, of course, again, let's not oversimplify. How does it do? How does your body remove and detoxify? Well, this is one way, is you want to be able to clear, these chemicals out of the body. And so you can influence the rate of that potentially, certainly by prebiotics, either by prebiotics reducing the levels of this enzyme. That was probably a bit of a roundabout story, sorry, but I sometimes
no, I love it. I love it.
It's interesting to patients that we actually have one way of looking at that.
Yeah, for sure. I know we've had Dr. Carrie Jones on the podcast a while ago, and I love everyone's different analogies. She talks about scissors. She's like the beta glucuronidase higher levels being like these little scissors that are sitting in there, like cutting these bonds for allowing reabsorption. So it's funny how that has stuck in my head as these like little scissors just sitting there ready to cut these tight bonds, as you call them, like those handcuffs. Just to separate. Love it.
Boring. So
it is.
Let's some pictures.
Analogies are the best. They're so good. But I really think that it was a beautiful summary of very complex systemic effect that we can see. But yeah, just how you've mentioned there about obviously very crucially the short chain fatty acids, but those signaling systems. I love how you keep referring back to that. And I think it's really good for people listening to think about these signaling molecules likewise as hormones, or how neurotransmitters in some ways can trigger off these responses. It's just really powerful image again for people to go, right, that's how it's behaving. I see. But whether it's anything local, like you've painted a good picture of how things are occurring locally within the gut, but also importantly that systemic travel as such, all that's literally of short chain fatty acids, but also those signaling molecules, whether we're talking about how things are communicating with the immune system, or how we're talking about how things are communicating with the gut brain axis, or as far as metabolic health, like we just have this beautiful flow through effect from the gut, which again, to go right back to the start, is where we're getting more and more and more research on as far as those health benefits, which I think we often say, don't we, we're in our infancy. I mean, there's so much already, but it's going to be amazing to see what comes of that, and even clinically what we see. But I'd love to chat a bit more about, and maybe this is where some examples might come in, that individualization of prebiotics and how we can look at using them with respect to gut health treatment. And I know this is a little bit of it's an interesting one because, of course, it depends on all of the factors. It depends on whether there's been, let's say, some testing that we've got in front of us, and then it depends on the client. But do you have some examples of how we may individualize that prebiotic treatment for clients, perhaps around certain types of substrates that we might consider using, and where we might use them or where we may not use them? Anything that comes to mind there would be great, just to give people an idea of what this looks like.
Sure. So if there's no extra data available in terms of microbiome testing, I think there's a couple of categories. Actually, there's a few categories that I and practitioners will often consider when they're trying to decide which prebiotic might be most appropriate for that patient to try. And I always think of them as trials, it's like, it's and to position them as such with patients as well, so that it is a process of trial and error and understanding what influence they have on the patient's symptoms in particular, because we probably have some sense of what they might do to the microbiome. We've got some really good evidence on that now, so we might go, oh, ideally I'll use this one or that one. Again, you might not have that microbiome data, but you might be sort of going, I'd like to reduce inflammation in the gut. What would I use if I was trying to reduce inflammation in the gut or whatever? But if we don't have that information, probably the biggest one that comes to mind for me is tolerance. And that's maybe because of the group of patients I see, but I find there's a lot of variation in tolerability of prebiotics. So that's one. Of course, the symptoms are, your focus. So whatever you're trying to change, you're certainly trying to not make symptoms worse. So, ideally you want some improvement in symptoms, before or while you're then laying the foundation for the deeper work that you might be doing over time. You want some improvement in symptoms. You certainly don't want worsening of symptoms. So that ties in with tolerability. But if the person has a gut complaint, let's say, they feel constipated, they're not going to the toilet every day, and they've got all these symptoms associated with constipation, like feeling of incomplete emptying, bloating, this kind of stuff. You would choose a different probiotic compared to the person who said, I've got loose bowels, unexplained loose bowels. And sure, they're having further investigations, or maybe they've had further investigations, but what would you do to alter the stool form? So with prebiotics, we do have reasonable information on what they're likely to do. Some of them are more likely to change the stool form than others, that's for sure. And of the ones that are more likely to change the stool form, the direction they move it in is I wouldn't say consistent, but is somewhat predictable. You certainly have more likely of a softening effect or loosening effect versus a firming effect, sort of thing. So if the person has no problems with their stool form and they've got no gastrointestinal symptoms, they're also probably more likely to be more tolerant of a wider range. So I've got more choice. But we also don't particularly want to change things. So if they're happy and they're going once a day and they feel great, we don't want them coming back going, I'm going 4 times a day. It's loose. I never know when it's going to happen. I had to leave my daughter's netball to go. Like, it's terrible. We don't even if we have our eye on the prize of this wonderful microbiome effect, a wonderful long-term health effect, we can't do that. So if we don't have the data, those are the things I'm thinking of most. The other ones, of course, are price and convenience. So, we work with our patients. We're a team. Like, we'll decide this together. Sometimes they will decide for you. Sometimes you can, cost is a major issue, and you need to not go for the most fancy, state-of-the-art, expensive prebiotic combo that's out there. And if the cheap one is going to do, then you go with that one. Sometimes they're traveling, so it's like they'd rather use, a powder than a liquid, or they'd rather use something that they can get in a sachet or whatever. But, ultimately prebiotics they're not super convenient in that normally you need them in a certain amount, and that's one thing that makes them different to probiotics. So when patients often do get them mixed up, and they'll say to me, oh, can I take this in a capsule? Well, you could. You need to take 25 capsules. It's like, it's like if you're with a high dose prebiotic that's like 25 grams or whatever, it's like, you're not going to, but yeah, so they're not always super convenient. And some of them blend better than others. So they are convenient to put in tea or water. And some of them are a disaster. We have lots of jokes about the glue drink or whatever for people who do, use their oat beta glucan in water, this sort of stuff. So those are the things that would influence direction. And then if we have their microbiome, well, great, because we've got a target of we want to increase or decrease these microorganisms that produce X or Y metabolite. But we still can't forget about the clinical stuff. and the tolerance. So quite often I will have the test come back and, oh, great, this prebiotic would be great. Yeah, no, they're not going to tolerate that.
Exactly. I'm
There's no
glad you
way.
said that. Yeah.
But hopefully there is another similar one, or there's like
Mm-hmm.
a compromised one, or you can do something else first,
Exactly.
or at least it helps that understanding that you might address in another way. Yeah, not always a perfect, yeah.
No,
X, Y equals Z sort of thing.
couldn't agree more. And I think it's so important, even again for the practitioners that are listening, or even for anyone listening who's excited about this conversation, to just head out and start willy-nilly experimenting with prebiotics. It's, if we have a test that gives us the information, it's like very valuable as a clinician to help our clients. But even then, as Alyssa is really importantly highlighting, it's not always that clear cut. Like 1 out of 3 tests, easy, I'll see this, where you can just look at one area, and the programs that a lot of these tests come back in now are amazing with all the information that they have tied into certain markers. So you can look at one marker and it'll be like, this is high, so use, this prebiotic. But over here in another area, as clinicians, we can see something else going on where we can see that would actually be counterproductive. So we have to be very careful with what we use, when we use it, and doing it in the most appropriate way. And I love that you mentioned tolerance, because I think there's beautiful studies that have amounts allocated to having a cause effect. And that can be really exciting to go in and go, oh, if I take 3 grams of this particular prebiotic, I'm going to get this effect. But we have to think about how each microbiome and each individual will deal with that prebiotic. So I know for us at JCM, we usually have a rule of going in low and slow and building up. I was actually just speaking to a client yesterday who we started on literally a pinch dose and working up that pinch dose, and had been generally pretty good for the first week or two, maybe a slightest little bit of grumbling, but only had hit, I think, maybe eighth to a third of a teaspoon of something that's usually around 2 teaspoons a day for a lot of people with no issues. And yeah, she had a day where she had to run to the bathroom and had this big ball of gas, and it was really so much discomfort. And it was like, okay, whoa, we need to back it off. And it's, that's the nature of prebiotics. And I find it, I'm sure you do too, it's ironic sometimes when it's the opposite, that you can start really low and it take quite a few weeks to build up to a therapeutic dose. And then when that client hits the therapeutic, their dose, they're like, oh, this is a game changer. Why didn't I start here? And it's like, well, there's a reason. You're just the lucky one.
Yeah. I always find it interesting looking at, whenever I would read prebiotic studies, I'm always looking at tolerance. Like, did you report on tolerance?
Mm-hmm.
I do find that some of the different studies, they kind of report it differently, if they report it at all, or they will say they asked about it, then they kind of don't report a lot of detail. But usually it's a one-liner, and it will be something like tolerability was good with no dropouts, or only one dropout in the experimental group. But so it's quite a low bar in some ways, like that if they didn't drop out, then they clearly tolerated and it was fine. I mean, there's that desire, to please the investigators and so on, that there may have been a lot of problems, and certainly when our clients trust us, they will tell us all that stuff, and we want to limit the amount of suffering and discomfort they have out of things. So there's a big difference between no problems and perfect tolerance, and it's really something that I think needs to be looked at a bit better in the study.
For sure.
There are some studies where you're sort of going, oh, okay, so they used 40 grams of resistant starch and didn't report any adverse effects. I'm like, who are these people? Like, where did they find them? Because they're certainly not people that come to see me. Like, wow,
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's and having that lovely relationship with your client, like between the clinician and the client, to discuss what is uncomfortable, what's maybe a little uncomfortable and bearable, or what is maybe going to transition to not being an issue anymore versus what is an issue. And everyone's different with that too, as to what they can tolerate. I know there's some practitioners out there that can be very hard and fast with it. They're just like, this is what it says, and this is what you're taking, and just suck it up, which is, I don't think really the best way to go about it. But yeah, I just think likewise tolerance is really important for success long term. And the other area in this I think of always is just food, like particularly as you said with costs and convenience. We can be looking at certain types of foods that we can be using in the diet for clients, whether, again, as you said, whether there's been testing or no testing. It's a beautiful way. I particularly find I lean into this for all clients, but I really love leaning into this with kids with respect to like what food that they can consume. I actually had I'm definitely not using any names, but my client, I'm sure, wouldn't mind me mentioning as an example, a client who's around, off the top of my head, I want to say she's 7 or 8, and happens to live on a property and has a pomegranate tree and loves pomegranate. And I said, oh, what do you think about potentially juicing that pomegranate and using that juice every day? And she's like, oh, she actually really loves just getting the pomegranate seeds and crunching on them. Would that be okay? I'm like, are you serious?
Oh, wow. Poster child.
So for those listening, pomegranate is a really important compound that we'll use a lot, and often we'll find it in practitioner supplements for various reasons. So it's just, for me, one example that I love to use in a dietary space, depending on what's going on. So it's not always an accessible food for everyone. But in this case, I was like, yes, winning.
Perfect, exactly. Yeah.
I think that's sort of slowly bringing us to the end, but is there anything else with respect to prebiotics or our conversation so far that you'd like to add?
It's to not feel overwhelmed, especially like if you're a clinician listening, like you just have to get the feel of these different ones. And like anything, it can feel overwhelming. We've got a lot of areas we need to be on top of, and sometimes it feels like, and there's so much detail with this. Like, make use of resources that are available, trainings that are available, little tables. I keep tons of cheat sheet tables. I wish it was all up here, but it's not. I constantly have to identify those. But I started in practice with a couple of favorite prebiotics. Secretly, we all have favorites, or a couple of favorites. Trying to broaden my, embrace all prebiotics, but I probably do. And those favorites have changed a bit over time. But in some ways, I think it's useful to have a couple of good all-rounders that you think you want to have a go with, that you want to try, and you might be thinking about tolerance, and you might be thinking about the array of different things that they'll help. So you're probably going to pick one of the, you're probably, I'm not going to single out the bad child, but, you're probably not going to pick inulin as your only one that you'll ever use in practice. I just feel like, it misbehaves probably a little bit too often for it to be like the one and the one that you focus on. Maybe it depends on the type of practice, but certainly if you have a GI practice, it's not going to be the one you would want to rely on. So you might pick one of the more tolerable ones, and then you work with that one for a while, just how you described. I love how, sometimes I think I'm the only one who's like starting at a quarter or going, you could even start with an 8. So I love to hear that you're starting with a pinch at times. That's, and not being afraid to do that. It's not a case of, they just don't tolerate prebiotics, I'll just try something else. Okay, well, yeah, like let's go low, because we often find improvements below the so-called research dose. I don't know if you got, but I'm like, wow, they're not even up to like the 5.5 grams of galacto-oligosaccharides, and they're better. They're emptying them, they're feel more complete, if they are someone who is tolerating it well. So it's not as though it's a black and white thing. Oh, they must get up to this research dose. It's like you can still potentially have benefit below that, but you'll have maybe one or two that you try for a while in clinic. And Goss was my favorite child for a while, and then started misbehaving. I'm like, what's happening? I thought Goss was a good child. It turned out I just had a lucky run where a lot of people didn't. It's like that's how it is in practice. You think we've got to keep an open mind. You don't still want to go, haha, my clinical experience tells me this, but actually it's only the 20 people I've used it on so far. And by the time I've used it on 50 or 100, yeah, okay. So maybe it's not exactly the same effect every time, but that's how you learn.
Mm-hmm.
And, so like, I feel like I'm using a broader range than I used to. I'm still not using them all in an equal at all. I've still kind of got ones that I'm more lean towards, but
Same.
I have over time, I've kind of taken on, let's try this one. What would this one be like? I definitely use the resources that are out there because, that can, someone else's clinical experience can, give you a few shortcuts, I guess.
For sure. No, that's really valuable. And particularly, as you said, having those reference sheets or cheat sheets or whatever we want to call them to refer to is really crucial because there's so much to know, particularly when you're then layering on food as well. And there's some great, as a practitioner, there's some beautiful resources out there with some of the testing companies as well. But experimenting, but again, being conscious of that tolerance point is really important so that your clients don't hate you.
Exactly. That's not the object of the game.
No, this has been great. And I think today's a really good conversation for the average listener, but also for other practitioners are going to take a lot from this. So Alyssa, if anyone wants to know a little bit more about you, where would they find you? Are you on socials?
Antisocial when it comes to socials.
Oh, yeah, love it.
I have is LinkedIn. I share a bit of stuff. I like to share exciting studies that I found and what they're making me think about. And please do comment and have a conversation because, it's that just makes it even more interesting. And the other place would be if you're somebody who crosses fields a little bit. That's a special interest area of mine is like how we kind of, bring our different fields together. And I've got a Facebook page called Manual Therapist in Functional Medicine for people who have a body worker or manual therapy or allied health kind of aspect, and also have the nutritional or the naturopathic aspect. And then there's a group that goes with that, which is nutrition and functional medicine for manual therapists. So, yeah.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. We'll make sure we pop those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. I feel like we could talk for probably another hour about this topic, let alone other topics, but we'll bring it to an end. So thanks everyone for listening, and thank you so much, Alyssa.